It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, July 12th, 2024. NATO name-calling irks China. A reformist wins the Iranian presidential election. And what comes next after French parliamentary elections produce no clear winner? Well, I'll tell you who is the clear winner. It's you, dear listener and viewer, because Sam Park is with us. He is in Los Angeles. Happy birthday, Sam.
Thank you.
A couple days belated. I am John Ramey in Los Angeles. A lot of attention here in the United States about Joe Biden's performance at NATO, but in the geopolitical, or from the geopolitical perspective, I would say it's the rebuke of China by NATO. They called China a, quote, decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. And NATO expressed concerns over Beijing's nuclear arsenal and its capabilities in space. This is reporting from the AP. The sternly worded final communique approved by the 32 NATO members at their summit in Washington makes clear that China is becoming the focus of the military alliance. Now, Sam, we've talked about this. China says they don't give military aid to Russia. They provide dual use components.
Well, they don't say they provide dual use components, but that's what they're being accused of doing. Yeah.
Now, Sam, let it never be said that I don't listen. I finally went to the Global Times, which of course is the English language outlet website, news website that is the Chinese Communist Party's like propaganda rag.
Yeah.
So, boom, Global Times says China strongly condemns the extremely irresponsible and provocative remarks made by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. They said they were characterized by a Cold War mentality, blame shifting, and shirking responsibility on the Ukraine issue. That was according to Lin Jian, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, said that earlier today. All right, what do we make of this? I mean, NATO's got a point, and China will deny and issue their propagandistic response, right?
Yeah. I mean, it all seems sort of par for the course, but there is a new sort of area of focus on China for NATO, right? They previously didn't concern themselves very much with China. And also, I think another thing that probably irked China to some degree was the presence of the Japanese Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, and the South Korean President, Yoon Suk-yeol, and the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who I think is named Luxon, but I'm not sure about that.
And those are not countries located in the North Atlantic.
No, they're not. In fact, there was some controversy in Australia because their Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, did not attend. And he sent something like the Deputy Defense Minister, I think, was Australia's representative. But that's still, sub-cabinet level representative of his country. Now, of course, Australia does quite a lot of trade with China, but then again, so does Japan, and so does South Korea. But from what I gather, there's some sort of domestic political kerfluffle that Anthony Albanese was supposedly seeing after. I don't know enough about Australian domestic politics to be able to comment on that. But still, these delegations are the sort of things that we might imagine China might not take very kindly. But really, on the whole, I would have to say it just sort of solidifies the already extant understanding of a sort of Cold War formation. And that, in fact, was one of the things that China complained about, right? Their sort of official position is we're not looking to be in a Cold War, right? It's the West that's doing that. And, I guess I can kind of see their point about that. And so since, as you say, these are not countries of the North Atlantic, so why are they, attending the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, by the way, is also celebrating its 75th birthday at this summit and welcoming two new members, Finland and Sweden, who have joined since last year's summit. So, I mean, there's not really a whole lot more to say about this, but it is just a sort of uh, continuation of the momentum towards more of a Cold War footing that we've talked about numerous times on this show already.
I will throw up what I found to be an intriguing political cartoon from the Global Times, and this is essentially criticizing NATO. Um, yeah, where it goes right there. Uh, Basically, it's saying NATO, stay in your lane.
Yes.
Now, I don't want to be naive. I don't want to be stubborn. You just said it. 75 years of NATO, essentially preventing nuclear World War III. So, unless you're the Chinese Communist Party, are there any real legitimate critiques of NATO? I know the so-called realists say that NATO expansion precipitated Russian aggression. I don't buy that, but I'm also not, a scholar. So I haven't really dug into that, but it's Mersheimer, right? That's the leading realist guy who I've been checking some lectures on. Like NATO's all right, right?
Oh, look, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, right? For instance,
It works.
if well, not just that, but I mean, if a country wants to join NATO, why should Russia have a veto over that? Right? These countries have their own policies that they want to enact. They have their own agency. Uh, is it really something we should is it really conscionable to us to say, oh, well, you can't join because the Russians might get mad? Nobody's attacking Russia. And it just that's kind of the way I feel about it. The situation with China, though, is a little different, right? Uh, Again, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, these are countries in China's own vicinity. Right now, no one expects that they're going to attack China, and I think it's absurd to think that they would.
It would be absurd to think New Zealand or South Korea would attack
Yeah,
China.
I mean, but uh, these are countries, especially South Korea and Japan, that have very robust defense alliances with the United States. So, on a certain level, I can understand to the extent that those alliances are being reinforced, that China can feel like they're being encircled in their own neighborhood, right? China is a major nation on Earth, and they're very happy to think of themselves that way. And for instance, you might imagine them saying something like, look, we don't have a military alliance with Mexico, right? Or, with Brazil or Canada. Why do you need to be here? And I think that there are good answers that can be
I mean, you and
provided.
I know that there are good answers to that,
Yeah,
but
but if I were Chinese, I might not think about it the same way. And I think it's important that we uh, keep that in mind. But for example, if Russia can't veto, the Czech Republic wanting to join NATO or Finland wanting to join NATO, joining NATO is not on the table for somebody like Japan or South Korea. So it seems like the Chinese case would be that much weaker. It has much more to do, I think, with China wanting to feel like they have their own sphere of influence in their own neighborhood. And that's not illegitimate.
shall we move to Iran?
Sure.
90 million people live in Iran. 90 million people. It's the 34th biggest economy in the world. And presidential elections were held in two rounds recently, the 28th of June, and then just this past July 5th. Reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian won the second round and won the presidency with almost 55% of the vote. These elections took place after the death of the incumbent president, Ibrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash in May. There were four candidates in the first round of the election. Pezeshkian won 44% of that. The second highest vote getter was Saeed Jalili. Pezeshkian is the reformist candidate. Jalili is the hardline candidate. So those two had the runoff election on the 5th. And Pezeshkian is now the president-elect. The Ministry of Interior in Iran declared Pezeshkian the winner of the election, and Jalili conceded shortly thereafter, just on the 6th, though, the day following the final round of voting, we can now add Iran to the list of countries who have experienced a peaceful transfer of power since the United States failed to do so in 2021. Good article in The Atlantic from Arash Azizi, who points out that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei could have avoided this outcome, a reformist winning, by simply not allowing the reformists to run. Pezeshkian had previously, this is now me, he has previously contested or attempted to run for president in the past and has been an active politician both in parliament and as like a county governor. He's also a cardiac surgeon. So just give us a thumbnail sketch of like how democracy works in Iran.
Okay, well,
and why this is of note.
All of the presidential candidates are vetted by a body called the Guardian Council.
Unelected.
That's right. In fact, there are 12 members of the council. Half of them are appointed by the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the other half are appointed by the head of the Iranian judiciary, who is himself appointed by the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So basically, the Ayatollah, the Supreme Leader, controls the entire membership of the Guardian Council. And the last time that Pezeshkian attempted to run, he was excluded. And dozens of people usually try to run for the presidency, and the great bulk of them are excluded for one reason or another by the Guardian Council. And so, as I say, Pezeshkian was excluded in his previous attempt, but he was allowed to run this time. For some reason, he suddenly became more qualified. I don't, how does this exactly work? It's worth noting also that in the first round of the election, voter turnout was something like 40%. Which was a record low in the history of the Islamic Republic stretching back to the revolution of 1979.
Is it of note that we're even allowed to know that?
I guess, but the point is that it's sort of like a show of democracy. It's like we're going to decide who gets to run, but we're going to have an election.
But it's just curated by the unelected powers.
That's right. And so in the second round, the turnout rose to about 50%, which is still very, very low. And I think many people believe that the Guardian Council, under the sort of direction or at least the supervision of the Supreme Leader, thought that this might not be a bad time to let a reformist candidate at least participate in the election, and if he happened to win, that wouldn't be such a bad thing either. For example, as you say, Pezeshkian in his pre-political career was a heart surgeon. I'm not certain whether or not he used in his political rhetoric for the election any kind of promise to heal the heart of the nation or anything like that. That's what I would do, right? But
it's right there.
Yeah, exactly. But in any case, even if he wins, the Iranian presidency is not a powerful enough institution that he could bypass the Supreme Leader. And so in many ways, we can attribute the low voter turnout to at least half of the Iranian population thinking this doesn't really matter. And I think they'd be right if they believed that.
Right.
However, as soon as Pezeshkian made it through to the second round, an extra 10% of the people said, you know what, we've got a shot. And one thing that Pezeshkian did campaign on was a pledge to sort of rein in the religious police force who go around, hassling women about what they're wearing. And as we know, this resulted in some of the largest protests ever seen against the religious leadership of the Islamic Republic after the death of the Kurdish Iranian Masa Amini in the custody of the religious police. And so in some ways, I think the idea is that the religious leadership figured, if we let a reformist be the president, it might at least reduce some of the tension that has resulted from the religious police just being out and out goons, which they are. Uh, and Pezeshkian also campaigned on at least wanting to return to the negotiating table with Western countries to try and reinstate the what was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, more familiarly known here in this country as the Iran nuclear deal, in which
President Trump pulled us out of. Is that
exactly? Right? That's right. It was negotiated by John Kerry, actually, the envoy for then President Barack Obama, along with numerous European countries and the European Union. And it slowed Iran's development of nuclear technology. It wasn't a perfect deal, but it did succeed. Since President Trump pulled us out of that deal a few years back, they've accelerated their progress towards gaining nuclear weapons, as we might well expect that they would have done. And so Pezeshkian indicated a willingness to return to that negotiation and try and reinstate the JCPOA or some successor deal to that. Now, I think this was perhaps a little disingenuous of a promise for him to make, because I don't think that even if a Democrat wins the White House here in the United States in November, I'm not confident that they would want to return to the negotiating table on that issue. I could be wrong, but
you mean Iran?
That is the United States. I'm not
Really?
confident that the United States would want to return to those negotiations. And it's because of October 7th. For instance, in the negotiations for the JCPOA, sure, the Iran's support for organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah was deliberately left out of those negotiations. And I think it would be difficult for any American president of either party to go back to the negotiating table and still leave those issues aside, and in this particular environment. And in fact, since being elected, Pezeshkian has said that he doesn't see any reason why Iran's sponsorship of Hamas and Hezbollah and the like should not continue. He believes that is a totally acceptable foreign policy stance for Iran to continue to have. And so if that's not going to be on the table, I don't think that that any kind of talks are going to be in the offing. And I also believe that the only reason Pezeshkian campaigned on this, and this is just my guess, is just because the sanctions that are in place against Iran since the end of the JCPOA are one of the largest contributors to the terrible economic state of people in Iran. And so what he was really trying to say is, I'm going to try and make things better for the nation economically. And I think, honestly, that's another reason why the religious leadership wasn't all that opposed to him running and winning, is because they know that he probably won't be able to get those negotiations going again anyway.
All right, I have two questions. One, I understand your point about entering into any negotiation as the United States with Iran and not explicitly addressing Hezbollah and Hamas. But can't you make the argument that any negotiation that slows the development of Iranian nuclear weapons technology is more important than trying to badger them into stop supporting Hamas or Hezbollah?
Oh, that's
just from a safety perspective,
that's
from a security perspective.
That is an entirely valid argument, and I don't mean to say that it's not. I'm just saying that it will be a difficult political sell for any American president to make in the aftermath of October 7th. That's all.
I'm just like, if you don't like Hamas and you don't like Hezbollah, you don't want their client or their patron to have nukes.
No. Again, you're right, but I just don't. I really can't see that happening in the American political environment right now. No, I could be wrong. I would love to be wrong.
Sure. And then, with regard to the supreme leader, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is it's a theocracy,
yes.
Right? It's a judicial theocracy. ultimately?
I mean, the Iranian state is very similar to the old Soviet state. It's enormous, right? There are a huge number of people in it. There are many factions inside of it. And so it's difficult to come up with
How
a
to
sort of
categorize it? Sure.
that sort of thumbnail characterization
Right.
of it.
But it's theocratic, and these elections are curated. But in letting a reformist or somebody who's perceived to be a reformist win, it almost, I have, this is the crudest kind of thumbnail theory I'm working on, but on some level, I'm not even working on it. It's just kind of occurred to me, like on some level, all governments are democratic at a certain point, right? Even the most totalitarian cannot deal with everybody out in the streets protesting, causing havoc, right?
Well, I
At
mean,
some point, it gets
there's always
democratic.
North Korea, right? I mean,
But
where
even the North Korean government can't have people rioting in the streets,
okay,
like
but
at scale.
that doesn't mean they're democratic on any level, right? And they're not. All right. So,
Or
I
I
don't want
guess
to.
maybe just sensitive to the populace. Maybe democratic is the wrong adjective, but you see what I'm saying?
I
Like,
guess so. Yeah. But
even something as totally unelected and not accountable to the people as the Islamic Republic still kind of has to be accountable to the people, especially
well, okay,
given what happened with the religious police.
they do, right? And that's valid in their case. I'm just in principle opposed to any sort of grand unified theory here, right? It, it,
And that's
it
fine.
Yeah, it works for them. And again, if Pezeshkian can actually rein in the religious police, that's good, right? But look at the turnout, right? If most people in Iran don't think this is going to make a difference, who am I to say they're wrong? Okay, just a little note for our viewers on YouTube. Since this is our Electorama 2024 halftime show, we decided we had to have costume changes.
Yes. It's only natural because you have to have a costume change in your halftime show.
Well,
It
you don't
must
have
be,
to.
I think it's in the
Rihanna didn't do it.
Constitution.
No, well,
Well, Rihanna didn't do it. That's fair enough.
yeah,
We're not as good as her.
certainly not.
To France and Politico's European wing, Dateline Paris, the left-wing New Popular Front coalition unexpectedly placed first in France's recent snap elections. But according to President Emmanuel Macron, that doesn't count as victory. Macron said, quote, "No one won," in a letter that he published earlier this week in local press, commenting on the results for the first time. Macron, quote, "No single political force achieved a sufficient majority on its own. The blocs or coalitions that emerged from these elections all represent a minority." End of quotation. We have a galaxy of graphics from which I will choose a couple to show the current allocation of seats in the 577 seat French parliament. Nobody's got the 289 they need. I believe the term is a hung parliament. Sam.
Correct.
So what happens?
Well, it's difficult to say. As of right now, nobody really knows, and I think they've got a little time to sort it out. But for instance, the RN, the Rassemblement National, the far right party, they actually are the largest single party inside of the parliament, and they're sort of discontented because they were declared the loser to the New Popular Front, which is an assemblage of four different parties. And so they can be forgiven for if they were to say something like, okay, we're an actual party, right? And we're the largest actual party inside of the parliament. And
would you like to hear what Jordan Bardella actually did say about this?
well, I know that he referred to the New Popular Front as and their alliance or their sort of joint strategy with Macron's assembly as an alliance of dishonor. But please go ahead and
Yes.
tell us what else he said.
Not only did he call them, quote, an alliance of dishonor, he called them, quote, dangerous electoral deals that had, quote, deprived the French people. Here is the statement. By deciding to deliberately paralyze our institutions Emmanuel Macron has now pushed the country towards uncertainty and instability. And then he called him an alliance, or called it an alliance of dishonor. That's Remember we talked about it last time. Like, is Le Pen's party, Bardella's party, uh, anti-constitutional or just hardline anti-immigrant racists? That's a little bit. That's a little. That's rhetoric I don't like to hear.
Well, I think that you're correct to have that impression because I've seen numerous RN members and surrogates on French television since the election who, and I'm glad we talked about the particularities of the French sort of electoral system in our episode last week. Now, I don't care to go through those again, but folks who missed last week's episode because they were enjoying their holiday weekend or perhaps dozed off during what was admittedly an excruciatingly wonky discussion, right? But some RN folks are saying since the election that if France had used some sort of proportional representation system like the overwhelming majority of European nations do, they would easily have been the winner, right? For instance, the RN by itself only got 120 seats. But they got, which is about 20 to 25% of the seats in parliament. They got 37% of the vote.
Whatever. They can get behind Al Gore in line for that.
Now, look, I understand that what you're saying, and I agree with you on the whole, but it's not like they have nothing to stand on here. And again, in our discussion last week, we mentioned if you had proportional representation, all any disgruntled voter would need to do is check the little box next to that says RN next to it, and that's it, right? But because it's a seat by seat contest, the RN actually had to run people with names and faces and things that they say. I saw France 24 had reporters on the ground in Calais, in Normandy, which is a long time RN stronghold. And most of them were just voicing sort of generalized feelings of disappointment. But one more savvy fellow said, yeah, some of our candidates weren't ready. And he's right about that. Some of these people are nuts, right?
They're hard right. And they put, who I just said his name.
Bardella.
Yeah, he's handpicked. He's this 28-year-old telegenic guy, handpicked like Le Pen. This is CNN reporting, to freshen the party's image and purge it of its racist and anti-Semitic roots. And of course, if you have to run actual people for actual seats, not everybody's going to be that polished and ready for prime time.
That's right. And quite a few of them really weren't. And so if you have to look at the candidate in your district and say, yeah, is this really the person I want? That's a whole different proposition than just checking the box next to the name of the party. And so this didn't work out real well for the RN. But as of right now, France still doesn't have a government. The left-wing bloc, the Nouveau Front Populaire, the NFP, they're negotiating amongst themselves to see if they can come up with a consensus prime ministerial candidate to present to Macron as someone that he should pick. The problem for them is that the single largest party in their bloc is La France Insoumise, or LFI, right? They are the hard left party.
And they are allergic to Macron.
And Macron's
allergic to them.
And for good reason. I mean, the leader of the LFI is this fellow, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and he's way out there. I mean, he's so far left. And I mean, he's, I would say, at least borderline anti-Semitic, and some members of his party, of the LFI, are full-on anti-Semites.
Sure.
They're so anti-Israel that they easily cross the line into anti-Semitism. And this is
sadly a long tradition in France.
Well, not just France, but I mean, all through the European left. For instance, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn faced certain, I would say, rather justifiable accusations against some of their members. And I think this sort of feeds Bardella's argument, frankly, right? It's just like, come on, the NFP, they're not a party, all right? They were just allowed to say they're a party for the purposes of one election. But most of those people, the socialists, the Greens, they never had any actual intention of sitting in a real government with Jean-Luc Mélenchon. They do not like him.
Sure. Sure.
And that's what I think that's one of the possible scenarios, is that Macron can cobble together a government out of the NFP without the LFI. But that would be very difficult because Jean-Luc Mélenchon, I don't like him at all. He is the most popular politician on the French left, period, right? No one else comes close to him. And so trying to exclude his party from the government when they're the largest in the bloc, it will be tricky. I would say, though, that the LFI actually lost seats in this election. They only lost like 4 or something like that. Whereas the socialists, formerly the mainstream left party of France, they actually doubled their number of seats.
Is that Francois Hollande's old party?
It is, yes. Yeah. And he actually returned. Yeah, he actually returned to run and won a seat in parliament. And so there is a case to be made for the socialists that they should have the prime ministerial candidate, even though they didn't end up with quite as many seats as the LFI. They had the largest momentum, right? They're the ones who actually gained the most, whereas the LFI actually lost a few seats.
I still can't. Just Bardella and the far right. What is it in English? National Rally. That's what they're calling it.
That's right.
Yeah. They're complaining against parties forming blocks well within the rules to prevent them from winning. And it's like, hey, bud, when you're the intellectual inheritors of fascism, that's what happens.
Yeah. And
people get organized to stop you because you can read a book and find out about it. It's
that's
not
right.
good.
And in the end, what you're complaining about, Jordy, is the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, right? Yeah. Which doesn't allow for proportional representation. And by the way, the only reason your party got 1 vote is because the president of the country decided to have the election under the Constitution. He didn't have to do that, right? And so this whole result that you've gained is because of the Constitution that you suddenly disdain, all right? And so, of course, this is a tactic familiar to do demagogues of the right and the left the world over. The world. If we win the election, it's because it's the will of the people. If we lose, it's because it was rigged.
So also about the NFP, the New Popular Front, was it Nouveau Front
Populaire?
Yeah. They chose their name in an attempt to, this is from CNN, in an attempt to resurrect the original Popular Front, which I did not know, that had blocked the far right in France from gaining power in 1936, back when the world was not quite as aware of the dangers of fascism, although they would soon tragically find out.
Yes.
That last bit was me, not CNN. But yeah. So it's a bit of, I was unaware they had chosen their name specifically hearkening back to another triumph of, however temporary, triumph of democracy against fascism in France.
Yeah, and good for them. But this, to be fair, Bardella has a point. Nobody knows what's going to happen with the French government, and that's a dicey position to be in. This is just another reason why the Olympics should be abolished, was because there's all this people saying that, oh, well, we can't be plunged into chaos on the eve of the Olympics. I'm like, who cares? Right? I mean, there's more important thing. The shape of your government is an important issue. It doesn't matter whether there's the Olympics happening or not, or it shouldn't.
Look, the French national soccer side made it to the semifinals of the Euro Cup. I didn't hear Mbappe saying that they lost on penalties because of the election.
No, I mean, the whole thing is just silly. But we're going to have to see how this plays out. This is just one of many things that we're going to have to keep an eye on for possibly for next week. They could form a government by next week.
Samuel, forgive me if I wasn't set afire by the topics for this week, but it turned out to be pretty spicy. Well done.
I mean, honestly, the French election, I think, is the most fascinating electoral story of the year, but mainly because it was just unexpected. No one knew it was going to happen, unlike all the other elections. And the sort of the number of moving parts and the drama involved, it's been fantastic. I don't know.
Let's be honest. they're French. It's always kind of interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That, and it's sort of
They cut the heads off their
right?
kings.
Yeah. I mean, in France, it's this big drama. Nobody knows what's going to happen. It's, whereas, in Britain, it's just like, oh, no. We had an election, and then everything turned out exactly the way everybody thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
It was
and
fine,
we had a cup of
blah,
tea.
blah, blah.
Yeah.
But one thing I would say for Electorama 2024 purposes is that let's not be hasty in our conclusions about this, right? Just because Labor won in Britain and the far right was staved off in France doesn't mean things are going well for the center left, right? In fact, the story of Electorama 2024 so far is incumbents lose, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're from the left or the right. For instance, the leftist party in Germany took a bath in the European elections, right? And really, it's the generalized discontent against incumbents. That's the story of our election festival this year. For the most part, there are exceptions, but they're very
But that's
few.
the general trend.
I think so. And I don't want to pat myself on the back at all for this. Many people have said this, right? You can easily find this going around in the commentary about world affairs. But this is, again, we're going to have to keep an eye on this. Next week, China will be holding its third plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. There's expected to be a statement about economic policy revisions going forward. And so that's something we'll need to keep an eye on. We might also want to return to Kenya, where President William Ruto just dismissed almost his entire cabinet due to ongoing civil unrest over economic policy there. So we'll have an action-packed episode next week also.
That'll do it for us. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. We'll talk to you next Friday. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.